So it's funny, when I first took this over and people would say to me, what are you going to do? And I would say, well, we're going to fix American democracy and prevent climate change. And they would laugh, and of course I would think, yeah, that does really sound ridiculous. But nonetheless, one of the reasons I, was interested in taking the job at the foundation was to work on this set of problems which had been of interest to me throughout my academic career. Which, although at the law school I was writing about courts, the question of what it takes to make a democratic system work had always really been at the heart of what I was focused on. So, and it doesn't take a whole lot of evidence to suggest that the U.S. democratic system is in some trouble at the moment. So, I'll just give a couple of examples of the kinds of things, though, that I want to focus on a little bit beyond the fight over funding the federal government and funding the debt, soon to be repeated, it looks like. But also just in terms of the system, we've seen this massive uptick in campaign finance spending rather on campaigns. The last presidential campaign, there was a total of $7 billion spent. 30% of that came from 0.1% of the donors. And that's not counting the $1 billion of that which was undisclosed, so we don't actually know. Presumably a very large percentage of that also came from the same donors. At the same time, there is an ongoing campaign for voter suppression. I suppose I don't need to say too much about that here in North Carolina. The Supreme Court set this off. Well, it had been developing over a number of years, but the Shelby County decision which gutted one of the central provisions of the Voting Rights Act, really set this off. Texas took the lead, and North Carolina and Florida have already followed, and there's a number of other states in which similar efforts are in the offing. We have the 112th Congress. The last one was the least productive Congress in the modern era. Now, you can say, just passing laws doesn't mean that Congress is doing well or not, but there is a point at which inaction really begins to stand out. And when you think about the scope and nature of the problems that the country is facing, the fact that we just had the least productive Congress is rather telling. The 113th, the current Congress, is doing its best, I think, to take that record away already, and looks like it's going to. At the same time, income inequality and social mobility are at all-time. Income inequality is at an all-time high. Social mobility is at an all-time. Who knows all time, at least as far back as we can measure, say through the end of the 19th century. And we've had a steady decline in civic education and knowledge about the system across. There was a recent study done that concluded that a college graduate today has the same level of knowledge about how our government functions as a high school graduate did 30 years ago. And that's a product of all sorts of forces, but the chief one being we just don't teach it very much. Particularly in schools, the number of courses offered has declined by more than 2/3 over the last 30 years and so on. And the upshot of all that, of course, has been a huge loss of public confidence in the government. So, there have been surveys taken basically since the New Deal on where the public feels, both with respect to the government as a whole and the particular institutions. Obviously, it bounces around a lot. If we're at war, or if the economy is good, or depending on who the president is. But it used to bounce in the 50 to 70 range, and it now bounces in the 10 to 30 range, which is a massive drop that has been pretty steady since the mid-1970s. Congress recently weighed in at 10%, which is the lowest ever recorded for any institution of government since they began recording. And again, that was before the most recent round. So I suspect next time they take a measurement, it will be still lower. The president is doing not much better. And even the Supreme Court, which is the most insulated because it manages to hide from everybody exactly what it's doing and why it's doing it, really, even it has dropped into the 30s, which is a huge drop. Now, all this matters, right? It matters enormously because, again, no matter what your views are politically, the federal government is really an important institution in the United States. No one can get what they want in the current system, whatever it is. Even if it's deregulation, you can't get it. So the federal government has a key role to play in governance in our country, and it's unable to do that now. More importantly, of course, the role of the U.S. in the world is enormous. So the incapacity of our government to act is having effects all across the globe, whether it is the inability to make any progress or make much progress internationally on climate, to the effects on the economies of the world because of our inability to fund our government and adopt policies that people can depend on. And it matters for philanthropy as well, right? the way I look at us, the Hewlett Foundation, that is, say, in all of the big foundations, we're obviously, we have relatively a lot of resources, but they're a drop in the bucket compared to any of the problems we want to work on. We're much too small to be able to do anything, but we're big enough to be able to move public policy from time to time and get the resources of government employed in handling some of the large problems, whether nationally or internationally. Now, all of that assumes, though, a kind of minimally rational political process. That is to say, the way we have traditionally worked is we would develop evidence or best models or practices. We could show that they worked, and then, if that was so, put it into the rational political process, and some number of them will be picked up and taken to scale. And that can no longer happen when you've got a political system that no longer cares about evidence or best practices or models, which is quite literally where we are now. So that's a huge problem for all philanthropy, all foundations. So even from a sort of more self-interested perspective, dealing with the problems of US democracy matter for us. We're spending a lot more money to get a lot less done on all of the things that we care about, and in order to do it, we have to engage now in forms of advocacy that are uncomfortable. They are legal, being recorded here. We do not violate the law, but that take us much closer to the edge than we would like to, and regardless of what the law permits or require us to operate in a way that is not really the way particularly the board wants to operate. So fixing the problems of the government to some extent are really putting us back in a position where we can do more good with the resources that we have. Now, I want to define the problem a little better. What is the problem with US democracy? Everybody sort of recognizes that there's a problem, but if you look at the discussions, there's a lot of different considerations that are being conflated together. Basically, they break down into three. So one is the problem of corruption, which writ large is really the role of money. I use that term in the sort of 18th century British sense, right? That's it's not people being bought in that sense, but it is the influence of money and power in shaping government disproportionately to the interests of those who have it. To an even larger extent, that's always been true, it always will be true to some extent, but to a much larger extent. So that's the role of money in politics. A second sort of set of issues have to do with voter involvement and voter engagement, voter education, voter knowledge, that whole set of issues. And then and that ties into all the voter access issues, and voter registration, and so on. And then the third set of issues are around the problem of political polarization. Now, those problems are not unrelated. They overlap and intersect in various ways. But in thinking about this problem, we're actually going to focus particularly on the problem of political polarization. That will require us, as I say, to touch on some of the other ones, but our sort of lodestar for this is to think about polarization as a problem. Why? First, the other problems have actually always existed. Polarization, while there have been periods in the past, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century, where we had political polarization similar to what we have today, it has been more episodic. And so we're looking at that as the real change in condition that can be addressed. It's emerged over the last 30 years, and that is, in effect, a precondition for effectively addressing the other problems. That is to say, polarization is the thing that is locking the government up so that we can't do anything about the other problems unless and until we deal with it. And by that I mean either the problems of democratic governance in the process sense or with the substantive problems that we want to, whatever they are, that you want to work on in whatever way you want to work on them. What we mean by polarization. So here is just a pretty standard, straightforward political science definition. What we mean by polarization is essentially there is an increased ideological coherence within each of the parties. So if you array, say, members in Congress along a continuum from liberal to conservative, what used to be a kind of wide bell curve is now narrowed significantly in each of the parties, and at the same time a divergence between them. So that the Democrats have gone like this and moved a little to the left, the Republicans have gone like this and moved actually a little farther to the right, and the upshot of that is there's literally, now here again I'm thinking particularly about Congress, but there's literally no overlap. The most conservative Democrat is to the left, pretty significantly to the left, of the most liberal Republican. And of course, the ability to find compromises depends typically on exactly that overlap, which used to be pretty substantial. The one effect of that, and also part of polarization, as we're defining it, is hyperpartisanship. By that, we simply mean two things. There is a growing perception on the part of the members of the representatives themselves in Congress that politics is a zero-sum game. That if I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. And there's no win-win situation here. And related to that is a kind of political attitude in which it becomes more important to defeat the other side than it does to actually get something for your own. If getting something for your own requires giving something to the other side, that is more of a political defeat than simply seeing the other side defeated, whichever side it is. And of course, the upshot of those two things is the gridlock that we see in government, which is the inability to actually act on anything, whether it's immigration, the Farm Bill, entitlement reform. I mean, pick your issue. And that's why we have such an unproductive Congress. Okay, so what can we do about that? I think everything I said now is, as I say, pretty straightforward. Pretty straightforward. The question is, given the importance of the problem and the nature of it, what can private philanthropy actually do about this? So the first thing I want to note is, it does seem to me, and this was one of the reasons I was interested, that this is the kind of problem not only that, well, actually, that private philanthropy is supposed to deal with. Right? That is, people in this sector love to talk about what big risk takers we are and how we take on the big problems that nobody else can tackle. Okay, if that's true, this is definitely one of those. Right? I mean, I've said, my guess is 10 years from now, if I last that long, I'll be stepping down as the president of Hewlett who wasted $1 billion accomplishing nothing to fix the federal government. And even if that's so, I will not, I think, regard it as having been the wrong move to make, because this is what we're supposed to do. And the reason is all those features of foundations, right? Which is we are largely we're an unaccountable large pool of resources that's supposed to be dedicated to the public interest. And that means we're in a position to take a disinterested view. We're not beholden to business or to the parties or to either party. We can take a largely disinterested view, and more importantly, we can take the long view, in theory at least. We can take the long view and invest in this for the long run in order to fix it. And there are very few institutions about which all of those things would be true. Large pool of assets, ability to take the long view without having to be beholden to any particular interest or need. Now, the second thing to note in terms of what we can do about it is, and I just want to put this out up front, when I say we, I do not mean the Hewlett Foundation alone. I said to my board, I presented this to the board in November. I got what I described to the staff as a limelight, which is mostly green with a little yellow. And sensible yellow. We'll go back to them in March for a final approval. But one of the things we said to them is if it's us alone, we're not going to do this at all, because that really would be a waste of money. The only way this works, and what will be for us a pivotal benchmark of success or progress early on, is the ability to get a group of foundations working in rough alignment on the issue. No one foundation alone can make a dent. It's got to be a broad effort. And of course, if you think back to the earlier point, it should be a broad effort, because every single one of the foundations that works in the way we do, even partly, which is to say trying to move public policy, has the same problem we do. Working on this problem is working on all of their substantive areas, whatever they are, because it is making it easier or more possible to get some sort of rational deliberation with respect to the issues that they care about. So now one of the things that we've done, I'll just mention so far in terms of getting this. Early on, it became clear there was actually a fair amount of interest among a lot of foundations in possibly working in this area, and nobody had any clue what anybody else was doing. So we got together, and one of the ways we're hoping to begin to foster the kind of collaborative effort we want with 7 other foundations, and we're doing a broad mapping or landscape of the field, but we're doing it a little differently than most landscapes, I hope. Because most of the landscapes that are done, they're one-time efforts. People do it at the beginning, and then they let it go because they don't care, and now they go on their merry way. And we're trying to construct this in a way that it will keep alive and continue to be updated. Partly that's a matter of technology. Partly it's a matter of data presentation, so we're investing a lot more. And I should say having 7 partners makes that possible. But also partly we're building in features like a gossip column, and so that there'll just be a constant flow of information, because it'll also be a point of exchange of information, so people as they are working can look to it, and then making it easy to make the changes and update it. So we're hoping that it will continue to go on. But the first thing is, once we have this down, is to then get together as a group and say, okay, now we can say who's doing what needs to be done, where's there no funding, where's there too much redundant funding, how do we want to handle this, and hopefully begin to work together. if I can remember off the top of my head. MacArthur, Carnegie. Barton said to me, Carnegie is the deli. So it's MacArthur, Carnegie, Omidyar, Rita Allen, OSF, and Arnold, maybe? The Arnold Foundation, yeah, and or maybe they're actually, they maybe didn't participate financially. They're just waiting to see. Two others, I can't remember. Okay, so now I should come back. What is it? I said, what can we do about it? What is it? Let us say we do need to define a goal, right? I do believe in, I'm still making up my mind about various aspects of what strategic philanthropy means, but the idea that you start with a goal definitely makes sense to me.
That's good, because that's come to all our feelings.
Yes, so I'm going to give you the statement of our goal, right, which is to see the representative now listen to all of this, because I'm going to then unpack it for you. To see the representative institutions of the federal government able to solve problems in ways that most Americans support over time. Okay, to see the representative institutions of the federal government able to solve problems in ways that most Americans support over time. So that high-level statement embeds a number of choices that we made after considerable deliberation. Let me unpack them a little. So first, the whole thing is policy agnostic. And that's really important to what we're doing. We have programs, right? I've got a climate program and a conservation program and an education program. And in each of them, we have particular policy goals that we want to see the government enact, okay? Achieving those is not the measure of success for this. And to look at it that way, and I should say some of the foundations we've been talking to do look at it that way. From our perspective, to look at it that way is to sort of completely miss the point of an initiative whose purpose is to fix democratic government. The idea here is you have a government when it's properly functioning, the policy chips are going to fall where they may, but you have a process that you can feel, or that the public can feel good about having. So, one of the people we talked to gave us what I thought was a really clever way to put it. He said, I could be a Red Sox fan. By the way, I could never be a Red Sox fan. I hate the Red Sox. But he said, I can be a Red Sox fan and want the Red Sox to win, but have an independent interest in making sure that the rules of the game work for all of the teams and the fans equally. Right, and so that's what this is. The foundation is I'd say the Cubs, but then we never win. But this is really about the sort of independent rules of the game, and then we're comfortable fighting it out in that process. Right, so the measure of success is not particular policy outcomes, but whether the national government addresses problems in ways the public supports. And again, you'll notice in the definition I said over time that it's in a way the public will support after the fact, if not beforehand. Okay, and that after the fact, if not beforehand, is also an important point. The goal here is a kind of Madisonian design for democracy. What we're trying to do is reconstruct a process in which there's room for real deliberation and compromise. Okay, so that a well-functioning democratic government, we don't want the national government either to just instantly reflect what the latest polls show the public wants, nor do you want it to just ignore what the public wants. The idea is there's a conversation that is constantly going on between the representatives and among them and their constituents, and sometimes the government will and should do things that don't have support of the public at the time they are done, but it should come to achieve that support. And there's a lot of conditions that need to be in place for that. For that to happen, right? Some of that has to do with the process by which, even if I disagree with it, the policy was enacted in the first place. Some of it has to do, sadly, with the way in which the policy is implemented. Some of it has to do with my sense of the opportunities and the way in which the policies can be changed and revised if they're not working and so on. So it's a large system focus, but there needs to be room for leadership in government. Next, you'll notice the focus was on the federal government. So there are problems in the state governments. From our perspective, they're different from state to state. Some states have bigger problems. Some states have different problems, whatever it is. That's, the way I put it to the board was, the federal government's a big enough problem as it is. So we just want to focus on the national government. Now, that will require a lot of work in the states, right? Particularly if you think about almost all of the law involving elections and campaigns is regulated at the state level. So we'll have to be working in the states. But working in the states to achieve some reforms in state law is different from looking for reforms that will improve the state government. That's just not going to be our concern here. And lastly, you'll notice that the focus was on the representative institutions of the federal government. Okay, and that follows from the above, right? That is, say, for what I mentioned before about wanting to reestablish a kind of the deliberative democracy that the Constitution was originally set up to foster. And the reason we want to emphasize that is, there are two solutions which are pushed out there a lot. One is the push towards more forms of direct democracy. We can use technology to harness huge numbers of people, to let the federal government know what they want, just to get it done. So we think that is bad for all the reasons people thought it was actually bad in 1789. Right? That is, so it is not. You don't want forms of direct democracy which react too quickly. You really want a process that is slowed down for deliberation. And at the same time, the other push that you often get is pushed towards more government by more independent agencies, courts being the classic. Right? This is, the writing that I did before I came was all against the Supreme Court and the idea of judicial supremacy, which struck me as wrong then, still strikes me as wrong now. That's a move which a lot of people want to make. Right? Just give more and more responsibility so we can get those decisions made by bodies like that, whether it's the Fed or the Supreme Court or whatever it is, less accountability. So those, and we want to resist both of those just on the belief that the long-term health of a democratic system really requires that the interests be balanced in representative institutions that are responsive but have a degree of independence. Okay, I'll talk in a minute about the particular areas in which we really thinking we're going to do our grant making, or at least approach it. But before I do that, I want to lay out a few general working principles that we're taking into the work from having thought about this quite a bit. So the first, and in some ways the most important one at the Hewlett Foundation, and we talked about this quite a bit with the board, was explaining that the usual sort of logic model of strategic philanthropy is just inapplicable here. That we didn't even try to develop one. We said to them, we're not going to try to develop one because anything we developed for a problem like this would mislead you and would mislead us. The political system, there's not a political system, it's a system of systems. They're all embedded within each other, they're all dynamic, both independently and in reaction to one another. So the concept of linear causation, which underlies the logic model and is applicable for certain kinds of problems. I think the logic model works quite well on our climate work. Right? If we can do certain things and bring down emissions by certain amounts, we can expect certain things to happen. We're pretty comfortable with that. But in this context, you can't make predictions like that. So instead, the approach we're taking is more along the lines of sort of spreading a lot of bets while monitoring very closely what seems to happen and being able to adjust quickly to opportunities as they open up, circumstances as they change. We go into it, sort of anticipating that there will be unanticipated consequences that we're going to have to deal with. That's always the case with political reform, and so on. But it's going to have to be that kind of. Mark Kramer has an article that he sent me. He called it emergent strategy, as opposed to, the logic model approach. Second, we plan to work on this in phases. So on the one hand, this is a long-term problem, right? It took decades to get to this situation, arguably since the progressive era, at least since the early 1970s, depending on how particular you want to get in your causes. And it's going to take decades to get out of it. And so it does have to be a long-term effort. At the same time, I can't conceivably ask my board to commit, now to a 20 or 30-year anything. That wouldn't be, so what we've done is we've kind of divided it up in the following way. We've said, look, we want a first phase of 3 years. We actually asked for 3 years. The reason we picked that is it takes us through 2017. We think it's enough time to do what we want to do in the first phase, which I will mention, but it also encompasses the 2016 election cycle, which we think will give us an opportunity to learn quite a bit about what's going on. So what we're looking in the first phase to is maybe some short-term changes. There were some low-hanging fruit that we might be able to work on, but mainly we're trying to see if we can lay the groundwork for success. That is to say, can we build the kind of collaboration that we think is necessary to move this over the long run? Can we shore up the capacity of the potentially good grantees that are out there? This is a field that really for decades has been deprived of funding. There's very little funding in this space. There are a number, even the big national organizations like Common Cause or the League of Women Voters are starved for resources, and it shows in what's happened to their leadership and their ability to manage their chapters and so on. And then, there's just huge gaps where there's nobody. So can we shore up the capacity of the field to do the work? And most importantly, in some ways, can we fill in research gaps? Because there's still a lot that we don't know in order to do what we do. And I want to digress here for a moment, because as we begin this work, we think one of the biggest problems, and I'll come back to this when I talk on the specifics, is in the public perception and in the grantee community, such as it is, there is an enormous amount of bad conventional wisdom about what the problem is and what we should do about it. One of the things we've been talking about is how are we going to capture the public discourse in ways that we can move people off of some of the ideas that people have about what we should do, as to which not only is there no evidence to support it, but in some cases there's a ton of evidence, again, gerrymandering being actually the most obvious, right? It's a huge political science literature to cast doubt, serious doubt, on the relevance of districting to creating any of the problems, regardless of which ones you want. I'll talk about it in a minute. But you read column after column after column after column, sort of saying this is the problem, and what we need to do is get nonpartisan districting. Look at what happened in California. And by the way, I will say what happened in California, we had two reforms, nonpartisan districting, top two primary. Since they both happened at once, a little hard to disaggregate them, but as far as I can tell, neither had any significance. What happened was the Democrats got a supermajority in the state, which would have happened with or without the redistricting. And with a supermajority in the state, lo and behold, you can actually govern. Sadly, of course, one-party government is not the solution that we want in the long run. So, but in any event, there is this general problem. So there's a lot of research that needs to be done to fill in gaps, but there's also the problem of getting the research out there. And one of the things that just it boggles my mind is I'll be dealing with some of our potential partners who will not fund in education or healthcare or whatever it is unless the social science evidence supports the solution they want. And then when they get to this field, they just ignore it. They don't even look at it. And I cannot quite figure out that disjunction. So it's just, can we get people to look at what social science tells us, and where it doesn't tell us what we need to know yet, can we fund it in order to do so? And we're already funding a number of major research efforts, both through some organizations, one through Brookings, bigger one through the Social Science Research Council, but also a lot of individual scholars in particular areas that we think need to grow. A third and final background working principle that I want to mention is the problem of how do we do this grant making without exacerbating the polarization itself. Right? That in some ways is our toughest problem. And you see this, most of the existing philanthropy that is in this space exacerbates the problem. Conservative foundations, fund to advance conservative causes. Progressive foundations fund to advance progressive causes. I can't tell you the number of progressive foundations that have come to us and said, we should be funding what they're doing because it's needed to counterbalance the conservatives. And of course, that just makes things worse. And that's true, particularly when you look at the particular solutions, right? So you have progressive foundations that are like, we need to improve voter access. What can we do to get more of those Democratic voters out there? And it's self-conscious and explicit that it's to get the Democratic voters out there. Well, that does not help, right? Not if you want to actually get a broad coalition effort to improve the operation of the system as a whole, which is mostly going to be a problem of getting, how do we get the independent and moderate voters in the middle back engaged to the same extent? And I don't have an answer to this yet. I mean, we know in broad strokes we need to somehow persuade funders on both sides of the spectrum to join. It's really, there's such mistrust on the right, and it's not like the Hewlett Foundation comes in, with the reputation of being a moderate, middle-of-the-road foundation. I mean, we have a progressive reputation. It's deserved. It's right. It is what we are. As I say, it doesn't matter for this, but getting conservative and right-of-center foundations to join with us is going to be a challenge. Equally problematic is having a grant portfolio grantees that is balanced. The biggest problem there is there are very few centrist organizations. Right now, most of the grantee options are either overtly progressive or overtly conservative. Now, there is space there, and that's because there's been no funding for anybody in the middle, right? The foundations will only fund those organizations, and as I say, after 30 years, we've had a lot of atrophy in the organizations that used to be pretty centrist. So we want to build some of that up, but also there are some, and hopefully a growing number, of overtly progressive or conservative foundations that nevertheless recognize the need to work with people who are on the other side. And so those are, we're happy to work with. I've become actually pretty good friends with Mark Meckler, who was one of the founders of the Tea Party. He left it and has founded another organization now. So he is a true believer Tea Party guy, but at the same time, he has a deep commitment to the idea of working with people who disagree with him, and he's been great to work with so far. So that's those. No, we're not. He doesn't need our money. So it's more like, but he's helped convene people for us and open up some conversation. Same thing, I met with Adam Meyerson a bunch of times because the Philanthropy Roundtable is a great opportunity, I'm hoping, to just start to engage in conversation. Okay, so with all that in mind, here are the areas of potential grant making that we're looking at. And these are pretty straightforward, although I'll go through them and say a little bit about each and finish on time. And we put this into sort of, one of my favorite philanthropy jargon words is buckets. I never heard anybody call anything that until I got into philanthropy. So we have 4 buckets in which we'll be working. The first bucket is we're just calling governing institutions. That is chiefly Congress itself, but depending on how this unfolds, might well include other institutions like organized interests or political parties. Preliminarily, though, we're thinking about 3 problems in particular. One is there something we can do about the rules in Congress? So the answer to some of that is no, because a lot of it are old rules that used to work fine, but that representatives today are willing to deploy in ways that representatives in the past weren't. So that's more the dynamic attitude that needs to be changed. But some of them are actual rule changes that have made things worse. So the filibuster has been changed. They just changed it back a little. I should say I think they made partly the right change and partly the wrong change. The one place where filibuster makes sense is judicial appointments. The only place it makes sense. I would have gotten rid of it for everything else and left it in place for judicial appointments. But it's good at least that the presidents will in the future be able to get their people into office. That was, I think, the most outrageous abuse. But the filibuster across the board it's both structurally not the same as it was historically, and of course is used in a much different way. But there are like a ton of other rules that and they run the gamut from things like they used to do roll calls in the House by voice vote. And then they started recording them. Well, once they're recorded, that gave an incentive in an atmosphere of hyperpartisanship to put up things just so you could get the other guy to vote in a way that you could have on record and use against in the next election, which makes that other guy want to do that to you. And then there's various changes in leadership control. So there's a sort of suite of rules within both houses of Congress that are worth looking at that might make it both easier for members of either party to reach across the aisle, and harder for minorities or minorities within a minority to block anything from happening, and we want to look at those. Second is the whole problem of bipartisan dialogue and relationship building. Now this is not, remember, none of these are silver bullets. The idea is we need to work on all of these at once. They all hopefully will contribute in certain ways. There is no question in my mind that on the one hand, this is not just a problem of, if they just talked to each other and got to know each other better, then they'd all reach agreement on policy. Clearly not the case. At the same time, there is no question that the fact that they don't know each other at all, and to the extent that they do, think they hate each other, makes it harder. So, there are reasons for this, right? Part of the reason is they're all spending literally 50% of their time fundraising. That leaves relatively little time. The whole, you have to be an outsider has led very few of them to move to Washington. They keep their families in their home states, which is another incentive just to be home all the time. So now you've got people who are coming on Tuesdays and leaving on Thursdays. They're spending half of their time while they're there fundraising. There's very little time for much of anything else. They used to hold lunches together. Right? They used to do briefings together. Actually, the briefings, I think, are the most interesting one. They used to do briefings where the leaders of the relevant committees would each nominate experts, and then everybody from both sides would be briefed by the same people. Now each party holds separate briefings. Each party invites its own experts to present its side of the facts. And so all of these kinds of things just make things worse. So what can we persuasion get something going? Second area, the most obvious one, is campaigns and elections. So this, as I say, is the biggest area in terms of what's happening now. It's also where there's the most of the bad conventional wisdom. But the problems are pretty straightforward, and we are going to work on them, even though we have doubts about some of them. So the first area here is campaign finance reform. And as I say, this to me is the largest area where it's not so much that it's what we don't know. There's a lot of assumptions made about the influence of money, about which I think there is a lot of doubt. In particular, the notion of sort of the more you spend, the more likely you are to win, and that never ends. I think, I don't know, my view, this is the view of most of the political scientists I talk to, although it's hard to establish, is there's a threshold. Once you get above that threshold, it's not clear that spending beyond it matters a whole lot. In which case, you could imagine a public finance system that would get people to the threshold, and then we just wouldn't need to worry so much. Maybe, maybe not. As I say, there's a lot of research that still needs to be done. I'm very unsure about the direct contribution of campaign finance issues to polarization as opposed to the corruption problem. Nonetheless, we are going to work on this, and here are the reasons we're thinking we should. One is it is such an attention grabber for the public that some progress in this area we think could be an important mover of beginning to restore public confidence in the possibility of reform as a whole. There's such cynicism, and most of the cynicism on the part of typical voters is around the issue of money in politics. So it's an important area to move to build public confidence. Second, anything that would free the candidates up from having to spend 50% of their time fundraising would be a good thing for the government. As I say, to the extent that polarization connects up to primaries, which I'll talk about, and the ability to get independent funding to finance people who are going to keep you held to the orthodoxy, it's a problem. The real issue here, even apart from what we don't know, is solutions are hard. So we can do disclosure. There's not much evidence that disclosure matters. Beyond that, between the Supreme Court and the fact that everybody thinks that because the Supreme Court said it, we have to follow it, there's not a whole lot of space for significant campaign finance reform. We think the most productive would actually be to strengthen the role of parties again. But I don't know how you're going to do that. The most popular reform out there, it's a matter of faith in the activist community, is the small donor idea. But from what we can tell and what little research there is so far, small donors exacerbate the problem of polarization because the small donors tend to be more polarized even than the big donors. And so we're not sure what we're going to do in that area yet, but it is one to address. Second is the area of modernizing voter registration and election administration. And again, we're not sure that this is a big contributor to the problem we want to focus on. But like campaign finance, it's an area of low-hanging fruit where there's a lot of public attention, and it can help build confidence in the possibility of reform. And it's a good thing on its own merits. I mean, the fact is the United States makes it harder to vote than virtually any other democracy in the world. The number of barriers, even in the states that aren't doing what North Carolina just did, that one has to go through in order to vote are ridiculous. And it's not that you don't need, or that you have to get rid of all those steps, but you could modernize the system in ways that make it considerably easier, that would be more effective and more efficient. There's no reason not to explore things like online registration. I don't know how many of you are familiar with ERIC, which is this system that the Pew people created that automates things and does it across states so that if you move, your registration automatically moves with you and prevents a lot of problems in the rolls and so on. There's all sorts of things that we can do that will just make the system as a whole work better. Third area is districting reform. So, as I mentioned, there's very little evidence that districting reform matters at all. And I'll both explain why briefly, and then it makes a bridge into the thing that I do think matters the most that we want to work on here, which is primary elections. So the simple piece of evidence that districting doesn't matter is the Senate is as polarized as the House, and they don't district in the Senate. right? So clearly something else is producing the polarization. Now that doesn't mean that districting is irrelevant, because it could be that there are multiple causes, and districting alone isn't the only one that you need, but it's also a contributor. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of evidence to support even that. So one is the fact that most of the districts in this country aren't gerrymandered in the way that most people think of it. Or put another way, most of the gerrymandering is natural. People have sorted themselves into populations so that if you're not self-consciously gerrymandering, you end up with districts that are not overwhelmingly, but maybe 55-45, 60-40, one party or the other. Democrats tend to be packed into cities and so on. So you would actually have to affirmatively gerrymander to create competition in much of the country. More importantly, if you array districts from least competitive to most competitive, and then ask now, where are the representatives elected in those districts relative to the population of that district, what you're supposed to see is as the district gets more competitive, the candidates will move more towards the middle. But you don't see that. It's actually pretty much the Democrats and Republicans are equally liberal or conservative regardless of how competitive the district is. Now, why is that so? And that's why primaries to me are the key that matter. Because, of course, what happens is you've got a two-party system. It's ensconced by law in most states. I'm actually fine with the two-party system. I think it's a good system for us. But it means when you get to the general election, you're only choosing between those two candidates. So what matters, of course, is how are the candidates chosen? And they're chosen in either caucuses or in most states primary elections in which you have astonishingly low voter turnout, 4 to 6%, who are the people who are the most extreme. So not surprisingly, you're getting the candidates who are out there at the extremes. And then whether the district is competitive or not doesn't matter. If it's competitive, you're going to have a competitive choice between an extreme Democrat and an extreme Republican. If it's non-competitive, you'll just be choosing the extreme, whichever party controls that district. So what can we do about primaries? So here, too, the most popular reform that gets bandied about is the top two, or the blanket primary, open blanket primary. Even though, again, not only here there is affirmative evidence that it doesn't matter. So California, we've had one election, you can't tell, but this has been in place for a long time in Louisiana, Washington State. They've got more than 100 elections. There's a number of studies that have been done that show basically it doesn't change who gets nominated. The reason is not too hard to understand. Really, say you've got 55-45 or 60-40, that's still enough that you're going to get the Democrat who would have won the Democratic primary and the Republican who would have won the Republican primary. And they're the ones that get picked. If it's a really close district, sometimes it can make a difference, but not that often. To me, and this is, if I could do two things. So one would be that RLC idea, engineer a moderating faction within the Republican Party to take control. But the other would be to increase voter turnout in primaries by decreasing the costs of voting in primaries. Okay? So you don't want to increase, so clearly if you increase voter turnout in primaries and you go from just having the extreme voters to more of the centrist voters, you're going to get different candidates. But if you increase voter turnout by encouraging people, that is, say, by enhancing their intrinsic incentives to vote, well, how do you do that? That means getting them angry. That's what you do, and that polarizes them, so that doesn't work. So what you want to do is bring the costs of voting down. Now, this occurred to me because personal experience, which is, to be honest, I never voted in a primary election until I moved to California. I always voted in the general election, but life is short, and I could never find where the polling place was, and so I would wait till the general election to vote. I moved to California, and they mail my ballot to me. So I vote in every election because the ballot comes right to my home. It made me realize, yeah, of course, you bring the costs of voting down, more people are likely to vote. Am I better informed? No. But that's okay. We don't actually need highly informed voters. The truth is we got along fine for a really long time without, that's not, wouldn't be a bad thing, but that's not as essential as just getting people to vote. People who are not going to be, swayed or find appealing the extremist candidates on either side. So ballot by mail may be a little tough, but there's all sorts of devices we can use to reduce the cost of voting. And of course, the idea would be to decouple that issue from general elections. Because as long as you're doing it in general elections, it reads Democratic to conservatives. Because they know they believe they'll do less well. But if you decouple it, now there's still the say, Tea Party wing of the Republican Party is not going to like this because it'll be harder for their candidates to get elected. But the establishment wing will. Same thing on the Democratic side. So you can at least change the political dynamics if you just focus on, let's change how difficult or easy it is to vote in primary elections and move things forward there. Okay, third area, and I'll move more quickly through these last two. Third area is citizen engagement. And here, again, we're not quite sure what to do. We know that we want to do something to mobilize moderate and independent voters. And we want to do it without getting them angry. So this may also still tie back into eventually getting the costs of voting down so as not to polarize but get more people out. But the truth is, this is one of the areas in which we need more research. We don't actually know if the people who don't turn out to vote, if they did turn out to vote, it would make a difference. So it would probably be helpful to have some idea about that before we invest a whole lot in trying to get them to vote. And then the second area in citizen engagement is we do want to work on civic education. We view that as a really long-term play. It's not going to affect anything immediately. But in the long run, the health of the system does require people to understand. And here it's not just that they know that there are three branches and what their names are, or that they know the names of their Supreme Court justices. Actually, I think that's irrelevant. It's that they understand the basic values and responsibilities of citizenship. And for me, the core one, which seems to have gotten lost somewhere along the way here, is the centrality of compromise, right? That if you're going to have a complex republic with many people with different interests, beliefs, desires, and so on, then compromise is a virtue and an essential part of the system. So that's and then the last area is media. And this is probably the toughest problem. Not that the other ones were pretty easy. So here the problem is pretty straightforward. This is just the problem of getting people on the same page with respect to what the problems are, right? So most of us, not all of us, I'm looking at some younger people here, grew up in a world where there were basically 3 newspapers and three television networks. They were all pretty centrist, and everybody relied on them. So we might still disagree about what to do about something, but we were pretty much in agreement about what it was that we needed to do. You wouldn't. I often have this argument with my conservative friends. There are plenty of things for liberals and conservatives to disagree about what to do about climate change. The idea that we're still having an argument about whether it's happening is idiotic, right? It's insane. And that's a product of a fragmented, polarized media in which a huge number of the outlets are not even professional journalists in any sense of the word, in which some of the major network professionalized media are nonetheless overtly political and self-consciously so, and so on. And then you have the whole problem of echo chambers and filter bubbles as people turn to sources that tell them what they already want to hear and so on. So what can we do about that? We're not going back to the world of 3 newspapers and 3. That's just not going to happen. So what can we do in order to at least begin to improve the amount of shared information that people have with respect to what the problems are? So here we're looking at 3 possibilities just to start. One is actually a straightforward thing, are there things we can do to reduce the degree of incivility? This is thinking mostly about the technology pieces. We've the comment sections, if you ever read, I'm sure some of you do on these things. So there are actually all sorts of little simple changes you can build into the way a page is constructed that actually reduce that. You require people to put a picture of a person. It doesn't even have to be them, and they become a lot less angry and incivil. The woman named Talia Stroud, who's working at the University of Texas, came up with this thing. If you change a like button to a respect button, it actually changes the way people respond to the information that's put in front of them and so on. So we're exploring various technology things that might be done to at least reduce that. The other 2, though, have to do more with providing sources of information. We need to come up with sources of information that people on the left and the right will agree on. So we're working on that from both ends. One is there are a number of independent investigative reporting outlets that are actually respected on both sides. The problem with them is they all want to become the new New York Times. Let's say they want to become, what they refer to in the business as destination sites, and they're just not going to do that. So we're trying to work with them and persuade some of them to instead become what they call distribution sites. You can think of a modern version of the old AP or Reuters network. So you'd have high-quality reporting that people on both sides respect that would just be made available and hopefully be picked up then on both sides. So the Center for Investigative Reporting That actually may be the only one so far. Yeah. No, there are some other good ones, but they mostly tend to. Not ProPublica. ProPublica, although it is really good, is perceived as too left. The other, and actually for me more hopeful one, this grew out of a conversation I had. I ran into the head of KQED, which is the public radio station in San Francisco, and he explained to me, I didn't know this, they're not a radio station anymore. They have a radio station, but they regard themselves as a producer of high-quality regional news. They have 150 reporters, which is about the same size as the San Francisco Chronicle, and they're growing. And they own the radio station, but also 2 television stations and a web page. And what they do is they produce news content that is regional, and they just put it out on all those sites, and they touch 50% of the Bay Area population alone. Okay, and you know, nobody goes to them for public radio anymore. People want NPR, they go to the website and they download podcasts and so on. So although they're formally, they really are much more a regional news producer. And the question is, and there are other examples of this. There's a newspaper down in Orange County. There's one in Texas we came across. You can imagine a network of high-quality local news producers who are, in effect, non-ideological because of that structure, network together so that whenever any of them has a story that's of interest outside their area, they just make it available. And the question is, can you do both top-down and bottom-up strategies in a way that start to at least generate something? I don't know, but we're going to explore that. So those are basically the areas in which we're, thinking of starting out, and that's basically the way in which we're going to do it. And let me stop there.
There's lots of food for thought here and questions. So I'll lead off with one question that occurred to me. You said that most of the gerrymandering was not intentional. I think about the North Carolina situation, which really was intentional.
Yeah.
And where you basically took constituencies that tended to be aligned to the left and moved them all into one big 40 districts.
Yeah.
So you ended up with 52% of the voters in North Carolina in 2012 voting for Democrats, but Democrats picking up only 4 out of 13 seats. So that was clearly intentional, and it really did distort the system really pretty badly.
Yeah. Again, I don't want to say that it doesn't happen. It does. Again, for us, the 2 points are, one, it's not an important contributor to polarization. It may distort which party gets to control, but the problem you have now is even if you didn't, you're still going to have candidates who are to the left or to the right of most of the voters in any way, and they're not going to be able to work together. But as I say, it does happen, and I'm all for nonpartisan forms of districting. I just, in terms of getting rid of the problem we're most interested in, it takes a lower priority than a whole lot of other causes that we think are more important.
Larry, it seems to me that a number of the issues you've raised are things we don't know yet. I mean, I think as I made the list of like 3/4 were things we don't know, and I suspect political science is a source to try to answer some of those questions. I guess the New Yorker last week or this week, Jill Lepore on the attack on political science. So how do we, so many people won't even validate biological science or chemical science or physical science. So how do we have enough credit? How does political science or fact-based inquiry, how do you approach that? And do you try to get a liberal and a conservative together to do studies, or how do you develop facts to answer your questions?
Yeah, I don't. So first, I don't. The fact that the people in Congress will try to defund things that they think are going to produce answers they don't like is irrelevant to me. I don't buy the attack.
Right.
So I think there's a tremendous number of good political scientists doing good work. And I'm happy to fund them in order to get the answers that we need, and we'll act on those answers. Mm-hmm. So it's not, we're not going to ask the government to make a change but it's a question of what levers should we be pulling or pushing, and that's a good way to find out. The defunding of political science research is a big problem. It's actually an opportunity for us in the short run, because we can affect agendas and get the kind of research we need because there aren't alternative funding sources. But right after it was done, I had some of the faculty. Do you know what the ANES is? The American National Election Study. It's the only and best longitudinal study we have.
Right.
So it got defunded. And so it was being co-done now by Stanford and Michigan, and I got approached by the Stanford people asking if we would pick up the funding. So at first I asked them how much it was. It's about $12 million a year. So that's nothing for the government, but that's a lot for us. So I said to them, and it's going to be a really bad thing if we get a break in there and we lose it. But I said to them, I can't pick up that funding even if I could pay for it because I'm stuck doing it forever. And if I stop, I'll be the bad guy. And so what I'm willing to do is think about stopgap funding if you come back to me with a plausible plan for how we're going to get government back engaged in it. But of course, they haven't come back. I don't think anybody has any idea how to do that yet. So, that's, the whole attack on science and research of all sorts is a big problem. To say it doesn't affect this for us because we can and are going to, and have already started funding people to do the research that we need on the questions that we need. And, I think it's easier now by virtue of the fact that they don't have as much choice.
Great talk, Larry. When I was a judge in California, I had the blanket primary case, and I was overturned by the Supreme Court, and then the top two went into effect. And both political parties opposed the blanket primary, and they hired many political scientists, some of which were from Berkeley, so maybe it's understandable. But they opposed the moderating influence of the blanket primary on the grounds that polarization would be a good thing for the system. So I'm wondering whether there's been a shift in that now that we've seen what we yeah, some of these people were very eminent, like Bruce King, for example, and I think
Henry Bruce has shifted.
Has he? Okay.
He also moved his name.
I can't channel him exactly, but the argument would go something like this: that the system that we had in the 1990s did not make room for the extremes. So parties were overlapping. They tended to be somewhat homogenous, and the argument was the people out on the wings, like the Tea Party, didn't find that they had representation. And so his argument was it would be better if the parties moved further apart, and lo and behold, they did.
Yeah, I don't think, at least as I recall the argument, and it's an old argument in political science, this is the old responsible party argument, which dates back arguably in the 40s, at least to the 60s. The idea was there was so little ideological coherence in the parties that voters couldn't know exactly what they were going to get. Yeah. And so I think, one, I'm pretty confident that, yes, hope you don't get what you wish for, because there definitely has been a change. Now, for what it's worth, I didn't write on this particular issue, but I always thought that was a bad idea. And a lot of it was because, and this is what we've seen, you have to link the nature of the party system to the structure of the government. So responsible parties in a parliamentary system make sense, and responsible parties in a presidential system with separation of powers produces, particularly if you have the kind of minoritarian rules built in, produces a big problem. So I don't think there's too much pushing of the idea in that form of responsible parties. Now, I should say there's plenty of room for ideological coherence with overlap. It's really, that's the to me the key. To me it's about the willingness of people to, after they've had their say, to recognize that what's important at the end is to get something done and to compromise with people on the other side. You could do that within a system where there's no overlap, depending on who the people are. So that's why it's not just about that. It's about all the other structures that have grown up to make it hard. Candidates can't, you will have, I've spoken to a lot of members of Congress who would happily compromise if they could. But they know the minute they do, Rush Limbaugh and Fox News are going to cream them on air, and that's going to hurt them in the next election. They're going to get primaried by, the Koch brothers or the Club for Growth coming in and funding somebody to the right of them or to the left of them now if they're on the Democratic side, because now we've got unions starting to do it. Mike Bloomberg's going to fund primary challenges against the people who voted the wrong way and gun control. Those forces make it even harder. So as I say, I don't think a huge amount turns on that debate or not, although the general wisdom, I think, is maybe a little less ideological coherence isn't such a bad idea.
The one thing that you haven't talked about in your big problem you're working on is the reported tendency in the last few years for people to move and live in areas where people think the way they do. Is that something you're trying to take into account?
Yeah, as I mentioned, that's the natural gerrymandering factor. There are various, so again, to the extent that I don't care that much about that, because the vast majority of the public left to right are moderate left or moderate right.
Yeah.
Right? So you can have a largely conservative or a largely liberal district. I just want more people in this, more representative of the actual district. So there are other solutions, even with that kind of sorting. That said, if you do deal with it, I think there are solutions, multi-member districts, particularly if you're willing to play with things like instant runoff voting. Can work. They can also solve the minority representation problem better than the Voting Rights Act did. So we actually are exploring opportunities like that. They go down hard in this country, even though they have been used historically. It's been a long time, and so people kind of take as natural the winner-take-all single-member districting system that we have. So it's going to be difficult to persuade people to think about these seemingly exotic alternatives, although they help to address those problems if possible.
Do you have any thoughts on this, Tom's yours?
Well, I guess one thing I was struck by a lot of the reforms or things you want to do are still politically loaded. Not everybody wants moderation. Not everybody wants compromise. Some people want to hold on to minority power, and the president and the Senate, it's because the individual senators like being able to have a personal veto over anything that happens there. So there's a lot that you'd have to overcome there. So between the personal stakes and the ideological viewpoints, it's going to be wholly apart from the complexity of it, but it's the idea of, we're just dealing with trying to improve representative government is not going to be able to avoid some of those things. There are reasons that people don't want the electorate to get to the polls. Okay, and that is party loaded to some extent. And those interests are not going to change. So it sounds. I guess you can get good PR for saying everybody ought to vote, and you'll get a lot of positive support from that. But the people making the decisions are always calculating what's it going to do to the votes on the party balance. So it'll be interesting to see. I'm on board with an awful lot of this, but it's certainly a daunting prospect, and it's the idea that you can get some consensus around what may look like they're just sort of procedural or technical improvements. Just the very idea that the federal government ought to work. Some people don't think it should. Grover Norquist wants to, get it small enough to strangle and drown in a bathtub. Yeah. And so if it doesn't work at all, he's pretty happy with that. So those are, to some extent, they're premises that not everybody's going to share.
Yeah, although, by the way, he can't even get it strangled. Right? I'd say it's pretty big, and he can't get it shrunk because he can't get any of it. So what you say is 100% right. So just a couple thoughts. One is, it's not that I expect everybody to be swayed by the beauty of being policy agnostic and improving democracy. That is the reason for us. We just need to be relentlessly open about that and upfront about it, and pushing it when the attacks come that, no, look, come on, you really want to help the Democrats because that's why you want all these voters and that's why you want to change it. Because you're right, every single reform code is either Democratic or Republican in a polarized environment. That's because in the short run, it helps one side or the other. In the long run, they're all neutral. So we have to stay on message about that simply to fend off or blunt some of those attacks. But we're not under any illusions that that argument is going to persuade people. As I say, we have to engage in the kinds of advocacy that we can in order to get things done. Now, the piece that I keep in mind about this is that's why I think of it as a 20 or 30 year process. We neither need to change all 50 states, nor do we need to do everything all at once. Right? Truth is, on if we can move a handful of states on some of these issues, we can begin to generate the kind of momentum which hopefully will make it easier in other places. So the question is, are there places that are ripe for the kinds of reforms that we can begin to make some progress in those places that can then build on it over time? That's the only way to think about it. We think of the progressive era as pretty telescoped, but actually it was like a 30-year period in which the progressive reforms were slowly instituted. And there was the exact same problem there, right? what I think is interesting about the progressives, apart from the fact that almost all the things they did turned out kind of productively to be a problem, was it's the only example of a process-focused reform effort that actually succeeded. Now, they did have some substantive issues, temperance and so on, but fundamentally it was a pro-democratic movement, and they got democratic reforms, but slowly they started at the local level, they did it in some states, and so we have to think about something like that with respect to, that's why again it's important across this whole array of issues and take what advances we can and see what opportunities open for making some progress in some places. If you can shift 10, 15 states in the middle, that'll have a big effect.
I mean, I think if you start and just, I'm thinking about North Carolina, Western period, because several of us are involved in efforts here to try to bring about some of these changes. But I think North Carolina has historically been a state which was very closely balanced. And what has happened to us happened here, and if it is closely balanced, this is a prime place where something could be made to occur, because there really is a constituency for a center here, which doesn't exist in some of the other states where they're not so closely balanced.
Yeah.
Joel.
Larry, you said a lot of things which was depressing. But I'm a little surprised that you begin with the federal government. If I were in your shoes, I think 50 states, I would say, let's get 10 of them that we could do something. It's hard to do with funding. And then if you get models, so we actually learned from California's switch, and we haven't learned enough. But that seems to me, the big goal of changing federal government strikes me as it's a much tougher interim goal. I mean, it's the ultimate goal, but the interim goal could easily be 10 states.
Well, and that may be what we do, although again, it's a slightly different focus. Let's say we will be looking to get election reforms at the same level.
Yeah.
But we can ally them with information about it. I mean, what you're looking for are models and stories of
So as I say, I think that will be,
and we don't have that.
Right, but I think that will, so again, one of the problems is the states are generally less polarized than the national government, although that's changing, and it depends, it's different in different states. But as I say, I mean, I don't know, our sense was, rather than the process for depolarizing any polarized state is itself a really long one. So it makes more sense to us, at least, to work on the kinds of reforms which will be true for both state and federal elections at the states, but keeping our focus on kind of loosening up the national government. Part of that also is those are the issues that we think are most important and that we care about.
I agree, they're most important.
Yes.
I'd love to throw out the idea of having climate be an issue that tries to bring people together, because like you said, it is based on fact, and I think we can bring that to the fore. Obviously, the messenger would matter. So you need insurance companies who are looking at higher losses. You need the military saying this is a security issue, and we need to take it on as some of the key messengers. And then you move that forward and try to bring people together, and then Republicans and Democrats tackle the issue together. Bill McKibben says 350 parts per million, and then BP says 600 parts per million, and you duke it out and figure out what the balance is. I'd love to see that. And I want to third North Carolina as being a prime state for taking this on, figuring out, okay, what works and what doesn't, because of its centrist nature historically and the possibilities.
On the first point, one of the things that we're doing and are able to do is actually both our own programs and then with other foundations and their programs, getting to recognize exactly that. So we are working, the climate folks, they are interconnected in just that way. On the other hand, the facts are overwhelming, and yet, so the causes are, there's some other set of causes, and that's what we're trying to get at that are not unique to climate, is I guess part of the point. We work a lot actually here. There is opportunities. There's the creation care movement, which has sputtered to a large extent, but there are a lot of sort of splinter branches out there, voices that can serve as trusted intermediaries to speak. And by the way, we gave up on 350 a long time ago. We have to. We're shooting for 450. Even that we really don't really think we can hold to, but it's a useful target to try and stay as close to it as possible.
Yes.
You started out quoting some statistics about people's belief in the federal institutions and stuff. Isn't the more fundamental problem the combination of the vast majority of American people, because of their lack of belief that the government's working, just being totally disengaged? So you take the very small voting in primaries, you take the fact that most people are too busy because of income inequality and a variety of other things, so that if you could get at the root cause, which was how do you get to the education issue you brought up at the beginning, of getting more people, more younger people, and that I do need to care, and this is participatory government. You do need to care about that. Isn't that a problem that could be more fixable in the shorter term?
I don't, to me it's a chicken-egg problem.
Okay.
So we're working on the chicken and the egg at the same time. That's the only way we can think to do it. So there is a part of it that is about trying to mobilize without polarizing, people, but at the same time sort of recognizing that there are reasons they became cynical and disengaged, and if we can fix some of those, that's as likely as anything else to bring them out. They need to have some sense that there's a reason. I have this argument with the disclosure people all the time, which is, it's not clear to me what good disclosure is, because most voters, they already take it for granted that the elections are bought and sold. They don't particularly care that it was X interest rather than Y interest. It doesn't matter to them. So telling them that it was X rather than Y, doesn't, and I think that's probably right. But, if we could do something about that, then just to restore their faith, their belief, the possibility that maybe their vote would matter, or that, so you work on both at the same time.
You were talking about campaign finance. You said something, I thought, if I remember correctly, about public financing as being a potential solution. It isn't clear that I started my academic career writing on public financing of campaigns, and I thought that this was a great idea. Sent copies to every member of Congress of the article that I wrote for law review about it. Mac was sitting back there, and I subsequently wrote another article I was talking about public financing elections. The traction that got was zero. And the idea, it's been tried in a few places, but it's never really supplanted, or in any significant way, the disequilibrium in private contributions where there's potential for doing that. That's my impression. Mac, do you have any thoughts about that?
Unfortunately, I'm pretty much with you. I do think, though. I wish I could dispute that. I do think that public finance still plays an important role in those races that have not been affected by big money and can prevent the tradition of big money, at least, or delay the tradition of big money. So I do think that, for instance, some of these judicial race public finance ideas have more legs, or could have more legs, than the top level gubernatorial races, senatorial races. I fear that public finance, the idea has passed, especially after Citizens United. I think that it's very tough for me to see how, before the dot-com boom and bubble broke, and before Citizens United, I could have seen a number of philanthropists get together to set up public trusts or endowments that could match, if not equal, the big money that you get through the system. And I thought that would be one way. Now, I'm just not very sure after Citizens United that there's a way of, in the big level races.
So I'll just some thoughts. So one, as I say, in my fantasy world, we would figure out a way to do the research that showed that above a certain threshold, extra spending didn't have much influence.
I think that's there. Gary
That's good research, and then publicize the hell out of it, and then have a public financing system that got you to that threshold, so that you not have the incentive to spend all your time raising money that you actually didn't believe was going to. Right now, as much of it as anything else is the candidates themselves believe that this is necessary and essential, and they have to keep raising money, and they have to outspend the other guy by a huge amount, and if they actually actually didn't believe that was true, then they wouldn't. And if it's true, then it's not that much of an effect. So that's a fantasy.
Yeah, as a consultant for 20 or 30 years, though, when we would be in the back rooms, it was pretty well accepted, except among the most nervous candidates who really didn't understand. Savvy candidates understood it was an adequacy issue, not a pure equity issue. That's
so
well accepted.
Then
in the
there is
consultant community.
space for a public finance solution that can make everybody feel that they've got adequate.
That's what Joel and I wrote on.
Yeah. And what year did you guys do this?
1984.
Okay, so it's a very different world now than it was in 1984.
Great year.
Now, the other thing that I didn't talk about, but that I think is really important, is the funding thing has been driven by TV, and that's about to change totally. Right? So the cost of, because outreach on the internet will replace TV over the next 2 or 3 election cycles, and it's vastly cheaper. Now, what effect that will have, I don't know. What the Obama campaign did this last time was quite interesting. I mean, they still spent a lot on TV, but they also managed to spend on 19th century campaign tactics, which is an army of volunteers going door to door in their micro-targeted areas. And that costs a lot of money, too. So it may be that when the TV money goes away, they'll just find other things to spend on. That's why parties were so important in the 19th century, right? You needed an army of volunteers. You couldn't buy one. The party provided it for you, and that gave the party control. That's why party-centered financing was a good idea, and that would be another possibility. Now, the question, is, and I think the chances of a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United are pretty close to 0. It's nearly impossible to draft one that isn't, wildly scary. All this, of course, being driven by the insanity of having the U.S. Supreme Court have final say over the meaning of the Constitution. I wrote a whole book on that. That's a different. I'll come back. That's a different talk. But it's the alternative that we had until about 1980, which is say most of American history, the Supreme Court was not understood to have final say over the meaning of the Constitution. They had a say. But very quickly, but all those devices that we've now persuaded ourselves are unconstitutional, like court packing and budget slashing and jurisdiction stripping, were used. And then knowing that they could be used, that moderated the court. And when we delegitimated them, the court took off, and this is what you get. Whenever I say that, all the lawyers we usually gasp. Like, court packing is a good thing, and it's like, well, yes, because once you know you can use it, you almost never need to. And then I'll just say one other thing about that, which is the presidents who did this in American history are Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, the Reconstruction Congress, Teddy Roosevelt, and Franklin Roosevelt. Not exactly a rogues gallery. Okay, so anyway.
Anybody have any other urgent questions? We normally try to stop them at this time, and there's a basketball game. We have to give up the parking out there.
One quick one. If indeed the people that show up most often are the extremists to vote, and if indeed we assume that the unwashed middle do believe in democracy in the way that you talk about it, is there a place, and I won't use the word party, for a third force? Rather than trying to change these two now extremist organizations, is there a place for a third force to appeal to the democratic ideals?
So I think the answer is, in theory, yes. In practice, the way that would work if it actually happened was as soon as it started getting traction, one or other of the parties would hopefully just absorb it and move towards the middle as a result. That's what traditionally has happened. Whether that can happen now, all of this is made harder by, so there's a lot of formal law that makes it really difficult for
of course,
any
the
kind of
structural
third party to
problems.
be established, and so that makes it much more difficult for that to happen, which is why it makes more sense to think about engineering it from within either or both of the parties. That was the RLC idea. Now, for what it's worth, I'm sure all of you have heard of no labels.
Yes.
So I'm deeply skeptical about one part of what no labels does, which is this notion that we're going to get a bunch of congressmen and they're all going to agree to be problem solvers, and we'll sit down together and solve problems. And of course, all they could come up with was, less government waste, which is. But there's something else they're doing that I think is really smart. If you look historically at the way the parties were actually built originally, there was no national party. These were little state and local, Martin Van Buren, the most important American theorist, because he theorized the party structure and then actually did it. So no labels, not subconsciously, but they're doing that. They're creating small state and local no labels chapters working at the state and local level to do what they want to do at the national level. And I said to the person I work with, we should keep an eye on that, because if there is a basis for building a third party, that's the way to do it. Because you do need, this sort of national network of like-minded groups that are willing to work together but focus on. So that would be the only way, but I think the odds are pretty.
It's sort of the way the Tea Party's done.
Yeah, they're really, they were so smart, because of course they actually ran, they control school boards and all the local, that gives them access to most of the candidates, and yeah, it's true.